Cities have their own peculiar charm, with a multitude of attractive views and samples of splendid architecture revealing a priceless legacy of the past. The changes effected by each season delight the eye, whilst presenting a variety of familiar views in a different light. The pursuit of leisure activities during blossom time, on sparkling summer days, amongst falling leaves in autumn, and winter playtimes all contribute to the stimulation of the citizen's senses. What would one choose? Perhaps the refreshing scents released after rainfall on pavements during a summer's evening. There is no telling whether we are charmed by the cities we love, or love all the cities that possess these charms. Riga is one such city, Latvia's heart and its proud capital, a magnificent and wonderful city with 800 years of history. Beautifully produced postcards bought by visitors and inhabitants in the early years of the last century reflect the myriad lifestyles prevalent at that period of the city's history. These historic gems give us an illusory sensation of presence, and we are transported back in time. So let us begin our journey at Old Riga, where Riga was conceived. The skyline of Riga is unforgettable. Approaching the embankment of the Daugava, we see that in the early 20th century there used to be the port of Riga, very large and very important. In the history of Riga, shipping has always played a significant role. The city owes its origin to the junction of important trade routes and as a convenient port. In the latter half of the 19th century, when Riga was part of the Russian Empire, in terms of export, the port of Riga ranked as one of the largest in the country. Many ships called at the port of Riga, amongst them the big passenger liners sailing to London, Hull, Hartlepool, Rouen, Antwerp, Copenhagen and Hamburg. A busy street ran along the river Daugava and past the port. Skirting it, conveniently close by the river and the port, was Daugavas Market, that had been established at the site as early as the 16th century and functioned until the 1930s. In the 11th and 12th centuries, there used to be settlements of the local population, the Livs and several other Baltic tribes. When in the 13th century German merchants and crusaders arrived with the Christianization mission, they started to replace the ancient horizontal log structures of the local inhabitants by the first masonry buildings. Since that time, continual changes of power and control over this territory started, and since then, Riga has become part of European civilization. The oldest churches of Riga can tell us some of the story. The Dom Church, with the harmony of its grand architectural forms and serenity of dimensions, is the pride of Riga and the whole Baltic region. The foundation stone for the Dom was laid by Bishop Albert in 1211. The monastery complex included a small yard framed on one side by the south wall of the Dom Church and on the other three sides by the cross gallery. Today, the Riga Dom is the seat of the Archbishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Latvia. The surrounding buildings house the Museum of the History of Riga and Navigation. In 1884, when the ancient organ was replaced by a new instrument built by E.F. Walker & Co. in Ludwigsburg, Germany, the early 17th century organ front was preserved intact. The biggest organ in the world at the time, it is still considered to be one of the best romantic organs. Continuous construction and alterations of the Dom church reflect the development of historical architectural styles from Romanesque in the 12th century to Art Nouveau in the early 20th century. Situated at the Dom church is the monument to the German enlightener, writer and philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, who in the 18th century was a Dom school teacher. St. Peter's Church is the tallest building in Old Riga, first mentioned in records in 1209. The building master Rupert Bindenschuh completed the new spire in 1690. At the time, it was the highest wooden structure in Europe. The total height of the tower, from street level to the top of the decorative rooster, was 120.7 meters. St. Jacob's Church was first mentioned in the records of 1225. After the Reformation in the 16th century, the church offered the first Lutheran service in Latvian. Today, it is a Catholic church again and the official seat of the head of the Catholic Church of Latvia. The Powder Tower bears witness today of the once strong defensive walls of Riga. They embrace the whole of the medieval city, only about 35 hectares. The present-day Old Riga is about 50 hectares large. The Powder Tower was built at the end of the 13th century, but it was given its present name only in the 17th century when gunpowder was stored there. The Powder Tower is now part of the Latvian War Museum building. Foundations for the Riga castle were laid in 1330. The three-storey castle for the Livonian order was a convent-type structure with a courtyard in the middle. The castle had two big round towers at the diagonally opposite corners of it. Tower of the Holy Ghost facing the Daugava and the Lead Tower facing the city. Originally residence of the Master of the Livonian Order in the 16th and 17th centuries, the castle was the seat of the Polish and Swedish administrations. But from the 18th until the early 20th century, the Riga castle was the residence of the Russian-appointed governor of the Vidzeme province and the Governor-General of the Baltic region of Russia. Today, with World War II and the 50 years of Soviet occupation in the past, the Riga castle again is the residence of the President of the state, just like it had been during the independent Republic of Latvia in the 1920s and 30s. In 1817, the first monumental memorial in Riga, the Victory Column, was erected in the middle of Castle Square to commemorate the victory of Russia over the Napoleonic Army in the Russian-French War in 1812. The total height of the monument was 14.8 meters, and it had supposedly been made after the designs of Giacomo Correnti. The monument has not survived. In the early 20th century, as well as today, the narrow streets of Old Riga display typical medieval buildings like the 15th and 17th century dwelling houses that tourists and Rigans call the Three Brothers. Houses like these, with one end facing the street, were the homes of the medieval Riga craftsmen. Warehouses, so typical of Old Riga, can be seen in Alders and Reformatu, now Alksnaya streets. With the development of capitalism in the latter half of the 19th and 20th century, a number of ancient medieval houses in Old Riga were taken down to make way for several big public buildings. Among them was the house of the Vidzeme Knightage, built in 1867 after the design of architects Robert Flug and Janus Baumanus. Today, it is the home to the Parliament of the Republic of Latvia. The Riga Exchange was founded in 1816, and its initial seat was the town hall. A new Venetian Renaissance-style building for the Exchange was designed by architect Harald Bossa and built in 1855. The ancient development adjoining the Riga Exchange was demolished in the 1930s, making way for the impressive Dom Square. A notable feature of Old Riga is also the building of the State Bank, designed by architect August Reinberg and built in 1905. The electric facades also bear traces of Italian Renaissance. Today, it is the State Bank of Latvia. Old Riga's medieval plan basically is still in existence. The early 20th century development brought about certain major changes in the ancient part of the town. The ground floors of the new big apartment buildings were converted into exquisite shops. The old 17th and 18th century houses too were reconstructed to house shops. A street in Old Riga was named Tiagonio, or Merchant Street. Known for its bustling trade and lively traffic, it is now known as Grazinieco Street. Shop signboards in the early 20th century Old Riga used to be in German and Russian. Latvians, with a few exceptions, were not yet rich enough to own shops in Old Riga. A characteristic shop of the early 20th century Riga, Schoenfeld's Stationers, with its inviting shop windows and a big signboard. The neat shelves of the shop stored nearly everything necessary for paperwork. Calciu Street can be considered the main street in Old Riga, as it led to the town square. Calciu Street was lined with hotels, shops and banks. In the early 20th century, as in the Middle Ages, the heart of Old Riga was the town square. It was quite small, only half a hectare, and it was considered to be the geometrical centre of the city. The 14th century building of the town hall was demolished and a new one built in 1756. It underwent a number of later alterations, its 42.5-metre high tower projecting into the city skyline. The town hall was destroyed in World War II, and after the war, the ruins were taken down. In 2003, a new building, pre-war in appearance, was built for the use of the Riga City Council. Today, as in the early 20th century, the statue of Roland stands in front of the town hall and overlooks the square. Statues of Roland were characteristic of many medieval European cities as symbols of their freedom, independence, and judicial authority. The original 20th century figure was erected in 1896. It has now been replaced by a replica. On the other side of the town square stood two richly decorated houses. The smaller, the so-called Schwaber House, was built in 1890, whilst the bigger one, the Blackheads House, is one of the most impressive buildings in Old Riga. It is an outstanding architectural monument whose original Gothic facade in the 16th and 17th centuries acquired a Flemish Renaissance silhouette to be transformed by later alterations. The original buildings were destroyed in World War II, and in 1999 their replicas were built. Two other buildings in Old Riga were homes to ancient and influential medieval organizations, the Big and the Small Guilds. The Big, St. Mary's Guild, united the city merchants. Its house, even after numerous reconstructions, was too small for guild activities, so between 1853 and 1859 a new building was constructed after the design of architect Karl Bene from St. Petersburg. Today, it has been converted into a concert hall. St. John's, or Small Guild, united the craftsmen of Riga. It too was pulled down, and in 1866 a new guild hall was built after the design of the city chief architect Johann Daniel Felsko. Both new buildings were remarkable examples of the neo-Gothic. Until the mid-19th century, the area of the present-day Old Riga was encircled by a medieval fortification system that consisted of high ramparts with gates in them, a defensive moat, ravelins, bastions, and the esplanade. It was demolished between 1857 and 1863. In the latter half of the 19th century, the whole area of the former fortification system and the surrounding esplanade turned into the building site for the new Riga prestigious administrative centre, the Boulevard region. It presents a unique ensemble of eclecticism architecture, rich in parks and gardens. The first big and important public building in this area was the First City German Theatre, constructed between 1860 and 1863 after the design of the outstanding German architect Ludwig Böhnstedt. At the time, Ludwig Böhnstedt worked at the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts. The Riga Theatre, that was founded in 1782, continued to function in the new building. But from 1837 until 1839, the celebrated German composer Richard Wagner had worked there as a conductor. In the early 20th century, the theatre combined drama with music. At present, it is the home of the Latvian National Opera. In 1902, the Boulevard region witnessed the construction of another important theatre building, the Second City Russian Theatre, designed by the architect August Reinberg. The new building housed the theatre company founded in 1883. In the early 20th century, it was one of the best in Russia, and it was highly appreciated by the public of Riga. It is now the National Theatre. The Latvian Theatre, that was founded in 1868, had no premises of its own, and it used to perform at the Riga Latvian Society building. This society was the bedrock of Latvian professional arts and science, and the focal point for the Latvian national awakening movement in the middle and the second half of the 19th century. The old building of the Riga Latvian Society perished in the fire of 1908. The Latvian architect, Ernest Pole, designed a new house in neoclassical forms, and the new home for the Riga Latvian Society was built in 1910. Today, under this roof, the Riga Latvian Society continues to function actively. In the early 20th century, Riga was accessible not only by boat and horses and carts, but also by railway. There were two railway stations, Riga 1 Dinaburgas station, and Riga 2, Tukuma station. From Riga 2, or Tukuma station, that was situated in Kalia Street at the time, in the early 20th century, one could go to the nearby seaside resorts, as well as to several cities, mainly in what is now Latvia and Lithuania. For example, Jelgava, Liepāja, Šiauliai, and elsewhere. Riga 1 was bigger. It was also called Dinaburgas station because initially, in 1862, the line reached as far as Dinaburga, now Daugavpils. With time, Riga 1 was the departure point for Durpat, today Tartu in Estonia, Moscow, and many other cities. Riga Central Railway Station now stands on this site. In front of the station building, a small but rich Orthodox Thanksgiving chapel was built in 1890 to the glory of God in thanksgiving for saving the Russian Emperor Alexander III and the royal family in a railway accident at Burki on 17th of October 1888. The chapel was taken down in the 1920s. In Riga, the city police headquarters was close enough to both railway stations. Joining the police headquarters in 1904, the new city central post office and telegraph office was built. Postal service in Riga had been functioning since 1632, and its old premises had grown too cramped for space. The new building was reconstructed in the 1930s, and at present it houses the Faculty of Economy of the University of Latvia. For the convenience of travellers, several hotels were built close to the railway stations. One of them was Hotel Bellevue on the corner of the present Rainier Boulevard and Maria Street. The second, Hotel de Commerce, also today is often chosen by guests from abroad. It is now known as the Hotel Metropole. There are no industrial enterprises in the Boulevard region, just prestigious development and parks. The only factory in this area was the gasworks, which produced the city lighting. It was built by the city canal in the canal gardens. The canal was a part of the former defensive moat that was not filled in. Embracing Old Riga in a semicircle, the canal is a distinctive accent of the boulevard area. At the gasworks, a small elegant bridge spanned the canal, taking pedestrians to the only elevation in the canal gardens, Bastia Hill. In summertime, a boat station operated here. Within but a step resided swans in a tiny house specially built for them. In winter, the ice-covered canal at Bastia Bridge was turned into a skating rink. The canal gardens, that covered about 10.5 hectares, were one of Riga's most beautiful parks, landscaped by the outstanding landscape architect Georg Kupalt. Bastia Hill and its surrounding area was the most spectacular part of the canal gardens. The hill was built when the city fortifications were taken down, in place and partly retaining the former Schmilsu, or sand bastion. On top of Bastia Hill, where in 1887 a cafe was built, its open terrace offered a wonderful panoramic view. Another favourite leisure haunts for Rigans was Vermania Park, now Vermanis Das. Opened in 1817, it was laid out in the area of the former fortifications esplanade. Anna Gertrud Wurman donated 2,000 rubles in gold towards the maintenance of the park, which was then named in honor of the Wurman family. In the early 20th century, there was a restaurant in the park, which doubled as a concert hall. In front of the building, a zinc-cast sundial was erected in 1866 that in 1899 was surrounded by 100 rose plants, the first rose garden in Riga. On summer afternoons, the music show in the park offered free military band music from 5 till 11 o'clock on 5 nights a week. The mineral waters establishment that produced and sold man-made mineral waters was popular with the citizens of Riga. Next to the mineral waters establishment stood a memorial obelisk to Anna Gertrud Wurman, unveiled in 1829. Dismantled during the Soviet era, it was rebuilt in 2000. The boulevard region around Vermana Park, today called Vermanis Garden, was remarkable for several big public buildings. Thus, the eclecticism facades of the regional court building display neo-Renaissance features. It was built in 1889 by the first Latvian architect Jānis Baumanis. Jānis Baumanis was the greatest architect of his time in Riga. In the boulevard region alone, he had designed 54 buildings, both public and residential. Close by was the Orthodox Cathedral of the Nativity of Christ. After the architect Robert Flug's project, it was built in 1876 to 1884 in the so-called Russian Byzantine forms. Its interior decoration was rich and sumptuous, created by the famous artist of the day from St. Petersburg Academy of Arts, Vasily Vereshchagin and others. Emperor Alexander II himself donated 12 Moscow cast bells to the cathedral. The Esplanade Park adjoining the Orthodox Cathedral was the place chosen for the monument to the prominent military commander, Field Marshal General Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, hero of the 1812 war. His family for several decades had been connected with Riga. The bronze cast monument, designed by the German sculptor Wilhelm von Schneider, was inaugurated in 1913. It was lost because, in 1915, it was taken to inland Russia during the First World War. A copy of the monument was erected on the original base in 2002. Esplanade was landscaped gradually at the expense of the undeveloped area of the former fortifications called glacis or esplanade. The vacated square, lined by 4 streets, was given to the War Ministry to be used mainly for military training and parades. The landscaping of the esplanade was not completed until the early 20th century. On the fringes of the square, there were 3 buildings that faced the surrounding streets. The Riga Exchange Committee Commercial School, in impressive forms of Gothic brickwork, was built in 1905 by architect Wilhelm Boxleff. The building now houses the Latvian Academy of Arts. The Art Museum was built in 1905 after the design of the art historian, building contractor and architect Wilhelm Neumann. The Baroque forms were favorably enriched by expressive plastic decor of the facades and the ceremonial stairs, the work of August Foltz, the prominent sculptor in Riga of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, it is the State Arts Museum. The biggest and most important educational institution in the city was the Riga Polytechnical Institute, the oldest higher polytechnical establishment in the Baltics, founded in 1862. The building of the Riga Polytechnical Institute took up a whole street section and was constructed by stages. The first 3 blocks were designed by the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, architect Gustav Hilbig, and built between 1865 and 1885. The eclecticism-style edifice, with elements of the Romanesque, now is the main building of the University of Latvia. Timur Bridge led across the canal to the Polytechnical Institute. The building of the bridge in 1901 was partly funded by the widow of the renowned artist Wilhelm Timm. The mid-19th century witnessed the foundation of several secondary education establishments in Riga, amongst them the Alexandra Grammar School for boys with tuition in Russian. The present occupier of the building is the Latvian Music Academy. Excellent education for girls was provided by the Lomonosov Russian Grammar School. Today, the school building has been much altered. The design of the 2 school buildings was architect Jānis Baumanis. The City Classical School worked in a new building built in 1867. The school itself, though reorganized and having its name changed a number of times, was in fact heir to the 13th century Riga Dom School. Today, it is the well-known State Grammar School No. 1. In the early decades of the 20th century, many private schools functioned in Riga. Anna Jastrzębski's private classical school for ladies was well equipped and typical for the period. It had a big hall, a gymnasium, and a spacious canteen. Well-lit classrooms, comfortable sleeping quarters and bathrooms. The main thoroughfare of Riga today is Brivības Street. Its name is closely connected with the Monument to Freedom. It was erected in this street between 1931 and 1935 in the very center of the Boulevard region. It was designed and built by the outstanding Latvian sculptor Kārlis Zāle and the architect Ernests Staulbergs. The Monument to Freedom is the significant dominating architectural and sculptural feature in the Boulevard area and the whole central part of the city. Sacred to the Latvian people, it is also a reminder and an appeal. Triumph of the power of art, pride of Riga, and the whole of Latvia. The monument was conceived and built at the time when, after long centuries under foreign domination, Latvia had gained sovereignty for the first time. This is why the monument had to symbolize the hardships and battles of the past, the physical and spiritual might, craving for truth, hopes, love of the native land, and above all, freedom. Today, it is at the Monument to Freedom that presidents of foreign countries, on visits to the capital of the Republic of Latvia, pay their respects to this country and its people. In the early 20th century, this street was named after the Russian Emperor Alexander I. In the place of the present-day Monument to Freedom until 1910, there were 4 rows of lime trees, at the end of which, from 1910 till 1915, stood the monument to the Russian Emperor Peter I. The author of the monument was the German sculptor Gustav Schmidt-Kassel. The monument was taken out of Riga during the First World War and later brought back. Electric lanterns in Alexandra Boulevard were erected in 1905. The sculptor, August Foltz, had featured them as a wing of the Prussian heraldic eagle. Elizabeth Street formed a borderline between the boulevard area and the former city suburbs. In the early 20th century, the suburban area beyond Elizabeth Street underwent a continuous massive replacement of the small wooden houses by big multi-story brick apartment buildings. Typically for the time, they were built in Art Nouveau forms, often in a peculiar manner that was unique to Riga. In 1997, this part of central Riga, together with the boulevard area and Old Riga, was entered onto the UNESCO World Heritage List. Traditional Art Nouveau features in the plastic decoration of facades can best be seen in the tourist-haunted Alberta Street, where most of the houses have been built after the civil engineer Michael Eisenstein's designs. Latvian features can be traced on the early 20th century buildings designed in the National Romanticism style, a branch of the Art Nouveau artistic expression. An outstanding representative of this trend in architecture in Riga was the Latvian architect Ēģenis Laubek. One of his remarkable achievements was the apartment house on the corner of Brīvības and Lāčplēša streets, built in 1908. 45% of the houses in Riga in the early decades of the 20th century were built by Latvian architects. St. Gertrude's old evangelical Lutheran church is visible from Brīvības Street. It was built in 1869 in Gothic forms by architect Johann Daniel Felsko. In the early 20th century, it was too small for the fast-growing parish. This is why, in 1907, farther down Brīvības Street, a branch church was built, St. Gertrude's new Evangelical Lutheran Church. The designer of the neo-Romanesque building was architect Wilhelm von Streeck. The Orthodox Church of Alexander Nevsky in Brīvības Street. It was built in 1825 in the Russian Byzantine style, wooden, plastered and painted. At the far end of Alexandra, or now Brīvības Street, the railway line was spanned by a flyover. The first viaduct in Riga, built in 1906. The beginning of the 20th century was a singularly important period for the industrial growth of Riga, with many enterprises successfully operating in various branches of industry. A high level of development was achieved in electrotechnical, chemical, rubber, wood processing, metal processing, mechanical engineering, and other industries. One of the biggest in Riga was the so-called Union, the Russian corporation factory of the General Electricity Company in Riga. Since 1904, it merged with the international concern Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, or AEG. It produced dynamos, electric motors and electrical appliances of many kinds. In 1914, the factory employed over 2,500 workers. The second half of the 19th century, especially the beginning of the 20th century, saw the flourishing of some of the workers' regions in the former suburbs of Riga. For example, Daugava, named after the Daugava river arm. The dominant point of the public centre for the region was the Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Holy Trinity. In Daugava, people of different nationalities, Latvians, Russians, Germans, Poles, Jews and others, had always lived harmoniously side by side. Among the numerous industrial enterprises in the early 20th century Daugava, the rubberware company Provodnik stood out. It was founded in 1888 and was the second largest enterprise of this kind in Russia. In 1914, the factory employed 14,000 workers. On paydays, money was transported under guard from the bank by long lines of horse and carts. The inhabitants of the former Moscow suburb used to be principally working class craftsmen and petty traders, mostly Russians and Jews. Amidst the wooden development rose several churches of different faiths. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jesus, the biggest wooden structure in Latvia, St. Francis Catholic Church, and the Great Jewish Synagogue. The latter was built in 1871. During World War II, fascists set fire to the synagogue, with several hundred Jews locked up inside. Today, the remnants of the synagogue walls and a stone mark the memorial to the Holocaust victims. Set on the right bank of the Daugava, Kaysera Wood, or today's Measure Parks, was in sharp contrast with the workers' suburbia as a region of remarkable urban development. Kaysera Wood, that in the beginning of the 20th century grew in a pine wood at Kishu Lake, away from Riga's industrial swell, was the first garden city in Europe. In 1900 to 1901, the first streets were laid out and the first house was built in 1902. In 1912, the Riga Zoological Gardens were opened in Kaysera Wood. At the time, there were 270 animals on view, representing 88 different species. Today, the Riga Zoo has animals of around 480 species. An important former suburb of Riga spread on the other side of the Daugava. How to get there? In various ways. The best way was across a bridge. The first permanent bridge across the river was the Iron Bridge that was built in 1872. The basis of the bridge was the wooden truss that had been worked out by Ethel Town, an American architect. The bridge was designed with a single railway track and a special pedestrian walkway outside the truss. When no trains passed, the bridge was open for cart passage. Next to the Iron Bridge in 1914, the railway bridge was opened. It had arched trusses and double railway tracks. In place of this bridge, the Daugava is spanned by a new post-war railway bridge. The oldest Riga bridge was built in 1714 of connected floats and was situated roughly in the place of the present Akmens or Stone Bridge. In the early 20th century, in this very place, was the pontoon bridge, built in 1896. Only pedestrians could use the bridge free of charge. Driving a small herd across the bridge was the cheapest, just 1 kopeck. Loaded carts were required to have a 20 kopeck ticket. The pontoons were used for mooring the tugboats. Electric trams in Riga first appeared in 1901, and in 1902 their way across the pontoon bridge to Daugava was opened. Argenkalns, which was part of Daugava on the Daugava's left bank, was accessible by boats, paddle steamers or the modern propeller boats. Their mooring point was at the pontoon bridge. Then they went across the river, past the yacht club, to the Argenskalna inlet. The charge for a trip to Argenkalns, first class, was 5 kopecks. In 1909 there was a boat to Argenkalns every 6 minutes in the daytime. In winter, Argenkalns could be reached over the ice. The Daugava crossing was supplied with a special plank path that was lit by petroleum lamps at night. A convenient means to cross the river was the push sledge, or by car. Landing here, at Daugava, the first that caught the eye was the Orthodox Church of the Holy Trinity with its onion domes, built in 1895 and reflecting forms that were typical of Russian architecture. Another was St. Martin's Evangelical Lutheran Church, built and subsequently altered in the latter half of the 19th century. Argenkalns boasted having more brick houses than any other part of Daugava. However, there were many gardens there and people kept cattle. However, many buildings in Argenkalns were wooden and today comprise part of the European heritage of outstanding wooden architecture. Some places today have changed face altogether. Trains ran through Tornakalns, past the Evangelical Church of Martin Luther, on their way to the seaside resorts. Tornakalns, another part of Daugava, gradually grew in importance as brick development slowly came in. Her favourite recreation place was Tornakalna Park, since 1910 called Arcadia. From Tornakalna Park, or Arcadia, there was a marvellous view of the Riga spires on the right bank of the Daugava, the inimitable skyline of Riga. Thus, as with the wings of our postcard butterfly, we have touched upon almost all the typical parts of Riga. Riga, the marvellous, inimitable city, with its centre and suburbs, streets, buildings, gardens, and the sweet scent of pavements after a summer night's rain. Lovable and loved, because it is unforgettable. The one and only Riga.